Elias Harlan rode into Dry Creek under a black sky split with lightning. The storm howled across the prairie, carrying the smell of wet earth and dust. His horse stumbled into the narrow main street, hooves splashing in the rivulets that ran through the mud. Every storefront was dark, every shutter bolted. The town had gone to ground long before nightfall. Elias pulled his coat tighter, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and searched for light. Only one window glowed, a small house on the edge of town, its faint yellow flicker fighting against the storm. Inside, Mary Cartwright sat rigid in her parlor. The sheriff's widow kept her late husband's rifle leaned against the hearth, where the fire spat and hissed at every gust that slipped through the cracks. She had been staring at the flame for hours, mind caught between memory and dread. Her husband's badge rested on the mantel, darkened with the tarnish of dust and grief. She told herself she kept the fire burning for warmth, but deep down she knew it was to ward off the dark. The thunder cracked, followed by the heavy pounding of hooves outside. Mary stiffened. The rhythm was wrong for a passing rider. It was insistent, circling. Her heart knocked against her ribs as a sudden pounding rattled the door. She reached for the rifle, cocked it with shaking hands, and edged toward the entrance. Another knock shook the frame. When she pulled it open, wind shoved in like a fist, snuffing half the candles. On her porch stood a stranger. Tall, broad, dust-streaked, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a soaked hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, carrying a weight of gravel and regret. "Storm's bad. Just need shelter till it passes." Mary's finger stayed curled near the trigger. She studied him, seeing not just a weary traveler but something darker pressed into his silence. Before she could decide, the night erupted with torchlight. 3 riders circled the house, faces hidden by bandanas, horses steaming in the rain. They laughed like wolves scenting blood. One leaned forward, voice cutting through the storm. "Heard there's a new man in town," the rider snarled. "Best he stay out of Dry Creek's affairs." The torches hissed as the rain struck them, their glow carving cruel shapes across the stranger's jaw. Elias did not move, but his jaw tightened, and Mary saw something flash in his eyes. Recognition. "Do you know them?" she demanded, rifle now squarely at his chest. Elias's silence was sharper than any confession. He did not deny it. The riders circled once more, laughter carrying into the wind before spurring off into the black. The storm swallowed them whole, leaving only the sound of rain hammering the roof. For a moment, the house seemed to breathe again, the fire crackling weakly in the hearth. Mary lowered the rifle, though not entirely. She was no fool. "You bring trouble here?" she asked. Elias removed his hat, water running down his scarred cheek. His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. Trouble was already here. She wanted to push him back into the storm, to lock the door and pretend none of this had reached her threshold. But grief had carved out something colder inside her, and loneliness whispered that sometimes danger was the only company left. A sound drew her gaze. The front door groaned on its hinges. She leaned forward, lantern trembling in her grip, and froze. Nailed into the wood was a sheriff's star. Its metal was smeared dark, glistening red under the lantern light. Rainwater dripped from it like blood that refused to wash away. Mary's breath caught. The stranger did not speak, but his eyes lingered on the badge as though it had been meant for him. The storm raged on outside, but the true storm had already arrived, standing in her doorway. Narrator voice after the star reveal. "A storm has broken over Dry Creek, and with it a shadow far darker than the night. If you want more tales where honor and blood ride side by side, make sure to subscribe now, so you never miss the next ride into the frontier." The storm had broken by dawn, leaving the prairie washed in silver mist. The town of Dry Creek stirred only faintly, roosters crowing somewhere in the distance, but most shutters stayed closed. Folks had learned to keep their heads down when trouble stalked the streets. Mary Cartwright moved through the quiet morning with her shawl drawn tight against the chill. Her boots pressed softly in the damp earth as she carried a small bundle of wildflowers down the path that led beyond the churchyard to the hill where her husband lay. The widow had not spoken much to the stranger who had come knocking in the night. He had bedded down in her barn, silent as stone, though she'd felt his presence like a weight through the walls. Now, as she passed the whitewashed fence that ringed the graveyard, she sensed rather than saw him following, his shadow stretching long across the wet grass. She did not turn. If he meant to guard or spy, let him. She knelt before the stone carved with the name Samuel Cartwright. The letters, once crisp, were now softened by weather, but the memory of the man burned sharp in her mind. Samuel, the sheriff of Dry Creek, had carried the law on his shoulders until the day it broke him. She set the flowers down, brushed a bead of rain from the carved letters, and bowed her head. "They think you left me weak," she whispered, her voice trembling with grief but steeled with something harder. "They think I'll bend, that your name can be dirtied and forgotten. But I won't let it happen, not while I breathe." Behind her, boots scuffed the earth. Elias Harlan stopped a few paces away. He had left his hat off, and the scars along his temple caught the pale morning light. She did not rise to greet him. "You were watching last night," she said quietly. "Those men, you knew them." His silence stretched, broken only by a crow cawing overhead. Finally he spoke, his tone low, almost reluctant. "I rode with lawmen once. Thought we stood for something. Turns out we didn't all bleed the same when the knives came out." She turned then, eyes sharp, searching his face. "Are you running from the law or from yourself?" He met her gaze, but no answer came. The quiet said both. Mary's breath shuddered as she faced the stone again, but her whisper turned into a gasp. Across the granite, smeared like a wound, was a streak of dried crimson, the same jagged mark that had been on the sheriff's star nailed to her door. Someone had come in the night, defiling Samuel's grave. Her hand went to her mouth. "They want me broken," she said, voice shaking. Elias crouched, brushing the stain with his calloused fingers. His jaw tightened. "No, they want you bound." Bound. The word clung to her skin like a shackle. When she returned to her farm, the mist had lifted, leaving the land raw and bright beneath the morning sun. She approached the barn with weary steps, meaning to fetch feed for the chickens, but she stopped cold. There, nailed into the wood where the door split, was a folded letter pinned with a rusty nail. Her hands shook as she pried it free. The parchment crackled as she opened it. The words inside were written in a bold, taunting hand. "You will remarry, and soon, or the town will burn for your pride. Choose wisely, widow. Sundown waits for no one." Her breath caught and the paper slipped from her fingers. The demand lay at her feet, fluttering in the breeze while the barn's shadow loomed over her like the gallows. Elias Harlan found her staring at the paper on the barn floor, as if the ink itself carried a noose. Wind tugged the edge and flipped it once like a fish dying on the bank. He stooped, picked it up, read it with no change in his face, then folded it tight and tucked it into his coat. "You know who wrote it?" Mary said. "Not a question." "I know the hand it rides in," he answered. She faced him fully now, the morning sharpening her eyes. "You recognized those men last night. You knew the badge on my door would bleed." Her fingers were white where they clenched the edge of her shawl. "Tell me the whole of it or leave my land." He held her stare for a long beat, then nodded once as if a verdict had been reached. "Years back," he said, "I fell in with a crew who called themselves brothers. They weren't, they were wolves in hats. I rode with them too long. Saw things done to folks who couldn't lift a hand to stop it. A coach outside Larkspur, children in it. They wanted to light it. I didn't let that happen. I took the reins and put it in the creek instead." He dragged a breath. Men don't like being turned by their own. "They cut me for it." He lifted his shirt. Across the ribs, a pale rope of scar ran from sternum to flank, puckered and mean. Mary flinched despite herself, the sight hitting at a place she wished had turned to stone. "You ran," she said. "I crawled," he corrected. "Then I kept moving. Your husband found me once on the trail. Could have hauled me back for bounty. He gave me water instead, warned me what was hunting behind, said if I was ever headed to Dry Creek to walk straight." He smiled when he said it. A light, almost human, touched the edges of his voice and vanished. "I didn't deserve that kindness. I still don't." The barn swallows chittered in the rafters, a soft chorus against the hard morning. Mary wanted to hate him clean. It would have been simple and strong. But the scar was a truth, and her dead husband's name in his mouth was another. Need crowded out simpler feelings. Need and the cold weight of the letter in his coat. "We're not safe," she said. "Not me, not the town. They mean to use me as bit and bridle. They mean to own the law by owning you," he said. "And every man who lets it happen will pretend he had no choice." By noon, word had run ahead of them like prairie fire. The church bell never rang, yet people poured into the square. Merchants with ink-blackened fingers, ranchers smelling of horses, wives with their aprons still damp. Mary stood on the step outside the dry goods store, lifted her chin and read the letter aloud. Her voice didn't quake. When she finished, the silence was a pit you could fall into. An old rancher spit. "Best say yes," he muttered. "Men like that don't bluff." The storekeeper nodded, eyes fixed on the ground. "For the town's sake. You could set terms. Keep blood off the streets." A younger woman shook her head, jaw tight. "They'll take everything after they take her." Mary felt the square tilt under the weight of their fear. Elias stepped beside her, not touching but close enough she felt the heat of him. "Peace bought with chains ain't peace," he said, voice cutting through the murmur. "It's the start of something worse." The murmurs broke into arguments. A pair of farmhands squared shoulders as if to fight each other. Instead of the men outside the horizon, the undertaker stood with hands folded, eyes steady, and said nothing at all. Mary's gaze caught the blacksmith's. His face twitched and slid away. She thought of the defaced gravestone, of the star nailed bleeding into her door. Samuel had died for a town that was deciding whether to sell its spine for a quiet night. Hoofbeats rolled in from the road like approaching thunder, but the sky was clean blue. Conversations died mid-syllable. Every face turned as 5 riders came down the street in broad daylight. No masks now. Sun flashed off gunmetal and buttons off a silver buckle shaped like a serpent biting its tail. The leader sat easy in the saddle, handsome as a poster and twice as false. He smiled without warmth and brought his horse to a stop at the base of the step. "Afternoon, widow," he said, tipping his hat just enough to mock manners. "Brought a gift." One of his men stood in the stirrups and flung something white through the air. It landed with a soft slap across the dust at Mary's boots. A folded wedding dress, silk already streaked with road grime, the lace catching in a splinter on the step like a net. The leader's smile widened as the town held its breath. The courthouse smelled of dust and stale sweat, its rafters groaning as though the timbers themselves were tired of carrying men's lies. Sunlight angled through high windows, striping the benches where the townsfolk sat in uneasy silence. Mary Cartwright stood at the front, her black dress dark against the pale walls. The wedding dress the gang had thrown at her feet lay folded beside her like a viper coiled and waiting. The doors creaked, and Dane Cutter strode in. His spurs clinked against the wood, his boots loud in the hush. He was clean-shaven, handsome in the way of men who never knew the weight of guilt, his eyes bright with mockery. 4 riders flanked him, their rifles resting loose in their hands. He removed his hat and dipped it low as though greeting royalty, but his grin stripped the gesture bare. "Dry Creek's widow," he said, voice smooth as oil. "I've come with an offer. An arrangement, let's call it. You wear that dress, say the words, and this town has my protection. No more fires. No more graves." Gasps whispered through the benches. The blacksmith leaned forward, muttering, "Could be peace." Another nodded, but others sat rigid, staring down at their hands, unwilling to be the first to speak against him. Fear hung heavier than the heat. Mary lifted her chin. "You call that protection? I call it possession." Dane's smile widened. "Possession? No, partnership. You'd be the lady of Dry Creek, your husband's memory honored, your townsfolk safe. Or," his voice dropped into a blade's edge, "you bury more names before the month's done." Elias Harlan, who had stood at the back wall like a shadow, shifted forward. His voice cut across the room. "You mistake terror for law, Cutter. You always did." Dane turned slow, savoring the moment, and his laugh filled the rafters. Well, the prodigal ghost." He walked closer, studying Elias as if he were a painting. "This man once rode beside us, widow. Ate from our fire. Bled in our name. Till he ran. Left his brothers in the dust to rot. Tell me, Elias," his voice dropped low, "did you tell her what mark your ribs carry?" Elias's hand twitched toward his holster. The air in the courthouse froze, the creak of leather loud as thunder. For one heartbeat, it seemed gunsmoke was about to claim the room. But Mary stepped forward, her voice ringing against the walls. "My husband's badge still means something," she declared, her hand pointing to the tarnished star pinned at her breast. "And it won't be buried in your dirt." The words stilled Elias's hand and pulled the townsfolk's eyes to her. For a moment, her late husband's strength lived in her voice, and silence fell sharp as a knife. Dane studied her, then chuckled, low and amused. "Fiery, I like that." He pulled a folded contract from his coat, sealed with wax, stamped by a circuit judge's ring. He tossed it onto the bench where the preacher sat stiff-backed. "Legal binding witnessed. Sundown, widow. You've till then to sign your name." He replaced his hat, tipped it mockingly once more, and strode out. His men followed. boots pounding in rhythm until the doors slammed shut behind them. The paper sat like a snake between the benches. Mary would not touch it. Elias crossed the room, plucked it up, and without a word carried it to the stove in the corner. He struck a match, the flare lighting his eyes, and set the edge alight. Flames licked and curled, devouring the parchment until nothing was left but a heap of black ash. But as the fire died, something pale caught in the cinders. A second sheet hidden beneath the first had only half burned. Elias bent, pulled it out, the edges still smoking. His face drained of color as he read. Scrawled in ink beneath the judge's hand was a list of witnesses, and among them his own name. Signed years ago when he still rode with the Cutter gang. Proof enough to brand him traitor to one side and criminal to the other. Mary saw it in his hands, saw the truth burn across his face. "What have you done?" she whispered. The ashes drifted in the air like black snow, and the scar beneath his ribs seemed to ache all over again. The courthouse emptied slow, like a grave being filled. No one met Mary's eyes. They shuffled out with lowered heads, whispers curling in the corners. Some muttered that maybe Cutter was right, maybe peace had a price. Others looked at her with pity that felt like betrayal. When the last door closed, silence pressed down heavier than the rafters. The burned paper's ashes still clung to Elias's hands. Mary walked past him, skirts brushing the wood floor, her breath sharp. Outside, the afternoon light seemed cruel in its brightness. She stopped at the steps, staring out at the street where children chased a ragged hoop, as if the world hadn't just bent beneath the weight of a man's threat. Elias came after her, boots scuffing softly, his shadow stretching against hers. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Not the truth, not trust, not the shame of standing beside me. I'll be gone before sundown." "He wants you, not me," her laugh came bitter. "You think walking will change the storm? You brought it with you, Elias Harlan, and you'll see it through." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. That night, the house glowed with firelight, the storm inside stronger than the calm outside. Mary sat at the hearth, the sheriff's badge in her lap, running her thumb across its tarnished edge. Elias stood in the doorway, shoulders heavy in the flicker, words weighing on him like lead. "Your husband," he began, then stopped. The fire cracked. He tried again. "When I was with Cutter's men, they voted to hang me from a cottonwood. Said a traitor deserved no less. It was your husband who cut the rope." He walked into their camp alone, pistol on his hip, and told them the law had use for me still. He pulled me out when every gun was pointed his way. Could have left me swinging. Didn't. Mary looked up, her eyes reflecting the flame. "Why?" Elias' gaze fell to the badge in her hands. Said a man could still change if he wasn't left to rot. "I've lived under that mercy ever since." He drew a breath, ragged and low. "I ain't here for love, widow. I'm here to pay a debt that don't ever clear." Her fingers closed around the badge until the metal bit her skin. She wanted to believe the words were only duty, yet something in the pause between them, in the silence he carried, stirred a different heat. Grief and guilt tangled together, pulling them close but never touching. The night held them in fragile stillness until the sound shattered it. Hoofbeats pounding, frantic, then a smaller set of feet tearing down the street. A boy no older than 10 stumbled into the square, chest heaving, eyes wide with terror. He screamed loud enough to shake the walls. "Fire! Cutter's men, they're burning the farms." The words lit the night brighter than flame. Mary rose, the badge clutched in her hand, and Elias's shadow stretched across the wall like a man walking back into war. Smoke lay heavy across the prairie like a shroud, the wind carrying the bitter sting of burned timber and scorched grain. Mary and Elias rode hard, hooves striking sparks on the dry earth, the boys' cries still echoing in their ears. As they crested the ridge, the glow of fire rose against the night, orange tongues licking the black sky. The nearest farm, one Samuel Cartwright himself had once defended from rustlers, was now nothing but embers. The house was gone, reduced to a charred skeleton. The barn still stood, but its roof sagged, flames crawling across the beams until they collapsed with a groan. Chickens lay scattered in the dirt, feathers blackened, the smell of death thick. Mary pulled her horse short, her hand over her mouth. Elias dismounted without a word, boots sinking into the ash. Narrator voice as the child shouts, "They're burning the farms." Fire spreads across the prairie, and the choices left to Mary and Elias grow narrower with every flame. If this story has gripped you so far, hit that like button and subscribe. Your support keeps these Western tales alive. At the barn's side, burned into the remaining plank, was a sigil, a snake curled into a circle biting its own tail. The Cutter gang's mark. But it was more than that. Elias froze as he traced the outline with his fingers. The wood was still hot. He knew it because once, years back, he had carried it too, branded into his saddle, burned into his skin when they cast him out. Mary saw his expression, the hollow way his eyes fixed on the symbol. "What does it mean?" she asked. He didn't answer. Couldn't. Her voice rose, breaking through the crackle of the fire. "Tell me, Elias, are you the spark or the shield?" He looked at her then, the smoke stinging his eyes as much as the truth. "I don't know anymore." The words dropped heavy between them. The gang had left this brand not just as warning, it was bait, a noose waiting for his neck. To the townsfolk, it would prove Elias had never left the Cutter brothers at all, that he was the fire behind the ruin. Mary turned away, fists clenched, fighting against the betrayal pressing at her ribs. But as she moved past the ruin, her foot caught something half buried in ash, a leather-bound book scorched at the edges but intact. She bent, pulled it free, and wiped away the soot. Elias joined her, his brow furrowed. He flipped it open. Inside were pages filled with neat columns of names and numbers, payments, tallies, marked in the same bold hand that had written the marriage threat. Dane's handwriting. Mary's breath caught. Tribute, Elias nodded grimly. Protection money. Paid regular. Folks in town have been feeding him coin while pretending to fear him. Hell, half the businesses you walk by every morning might already be his. The deeper they turned, the darker it grew. Names she knew, names she trusted. The butcher. The livery owner. Farmers from the outskirts. A web woven into the very soil of Dry Creek. Mary's throat tightened, rage and grief mixing until they were indistinguishable. He already owns half the town. Elias's jaw worked, teeth grinding, and the other half's too scared to stand up. He don't need to ride in with guns. He's already inside their pockets. Mary's hand shook as she turned another page. Then she froze, her eyes locked on a familiar name scrawled clear across the ledger. Samuel Cartwright's own deputy. The man who had sworn to stand at her husband's side. The man who had carried his coffin. The page trembled in her hands as she whispered almost to herself. All this time. He was the one who broke him. The barn groaned, sending sparks into the sky, but the real fire was already alive in Mary's eyes. Sunday morning, the bell tolled over Dry Creek, its hollow clang rolling across the rooftops and drifting out onto the prairie. The church was already crowded when Mary Cartwright stepped through its doors, black shawl drawn tight, her face pale but set with steel. In her hands she carried the scorched ledger wrapped in cloth, as though it were a holy relic instead of the poison it contained. Elias followed, hat in his hands, his scar catching the shaft of light that spilled through the stained glass. The air inside was thick with the smell of oil lamps and nervous sweat. The townsfolk turned as she walked down the aisle, whispers rising. She climbed the pulpit steps where her husband once read scripture and set the ledger down upon the Bible. The sound echoed sharp in the hush. "You all know why we're here," she began, her voice carrying steady even as her hands trembled. "You heard Cutter's threat. You saw the dress he threw at my feet. You think the only choice is between my chains and your graves." She lifted the ledger high, pages fluttering. "But this is the truth. This is the rot that's been feeding him all along." She opened it, reading names aloud one by one. The butcher. The livery keeper. 2 ranchers from the North Ridge. Gasps rippled like waves through the pews, faces blanching, some guilty, some betrayed. When she spoke the next name, silence crashed over the room. The deputy. The very man who had carried Samuel Cartwright's coffin, his hand resting solemn on her shoulder as she wept. The deputy shot to his feet, face crimson. "Lies!" he shouted, voice cracking. Fabrications. A widow's grief turned to madness. He pushed down the aisle toward her, hand reaching for the book, but Elias moved quicker. He seized the man by the collar, drove him against the altar so hard the wood groaned. Gasps rose from the benches. The deputy thrashed, but Elias's grip was iron. His other hand plunged into the man's coat and dragged out a folded badge, tarnished and still slick with ash. Cutter's mark etched across the back. The church froze. Mary's voice broke the silence, sharp and steady. "You chose silver over steel. My husband died for this town, while you sold it for coins and cowardice. You'll answer before it." The deputy sagged in Elias's grip, the fight gone from him. The townsfolk erupted, first in shouts of anger, then in voices of unity, the murmur growing into a roar. Men and women rose to their feet, fists clenched, fury alight in their faces. For the first time since Samuel's death, the town's spine seemed to stiffen. An old rancher raised his hand high. No more. The blacksmith thundered, "We stand with the widow." Even those who had paid Cutter's tribute dropped their eyes in shame as the crowd surged around Mary, not with pity, but with resolve. The church shook with their voices, a congregation turned into an army. But outside another sound rose to meet them. The rumble of hooves, the scrape of boots, men gathering, their torches lighting the windows like hellfire pressing in. Elias turned toward the doors, jaw tight. Then the pounding came, once, twice. The hinges quivered. And on the third strike, the double doors flew open, slamming against the walls with a boom that drowned every voice. Torchlight flooded in, blinding against the lamplight. Dane Cutter stood framed in the glow, his men fanning out behind him like shadows with fire in their hands. His smile gleamed cruel, his voice smooth as he called into the pews. "Come forth, widow. Put on the dress, take my hand, and this house of God will stand." Refused. He lifted his torch high, flame-dripping sparks, and every soul here burns with it. The sun was a burning coin in the sky when Mary Cartwright pushed open the church doors. Heat struck her like a wall, brighter and harsher after the dark interior. She stepped out onto the dust of the square, her black dress fluttering in the hot wind, and the crowd inside pressed against the windows and doorframes to watch. The torches Cutter's men carried looked pale in the daylight now, but the rifles they gripped gleamed sharp. Dane Cutter waited in the center of the square, his horse stamping restless, his smile wide and false. He raised a hand as though greeting an old friend. "There she is, the bride of Dry Creek." His voice carried smooth, confident, as if the outcome had already been written. Mary stood alone for a breath, her shadow sharp against the earth. Then footsteps followed. Elias Harlan came down the steps behind her, rifle steady in his grip, his hat low, the scar on his face cutting pale against the sun. He did not stand beside her, but a pace behind, the unspoken mark of a guard who would take the bullet meant for her. Dane's smile faltered, though only for an instant. "You let him follow you, widow. Careful, that man's a snake. He betrayed us once. He'll betray you too." His gaze cut across the watching townsfolk. "He signed his name to our brotherhood. I've got the papers to prove it. You all saw the mark. You all know what he is." The silence in the square was heavy, the townsfolk shifting, torn between fear and the memory of the ledger Mary had read aloud. Cutter leaned forward in the saddle, voice smooth as poison. "Say his name, widow. Say he's a traitor, and I'll grant you peace. This town, your farms, your children, safe. All it takes is one word." Mary's hand trembled at her side. She could feel every eye fixed on her, waiting. Elias said nothing, his face still, though she could sense the weight of his shame pressing down like iron. He had offered to leave before. Now he stood ready to bear the blame. Mary lifted her chin. Her voice rang across the square, clear and steady. "This town chooses honor, not chains. Elias Harlan is no traitor. He is my protector." She drew Samuel's badge from her dress pocket, held it high so the sun struck it. "This still means something, and it won't be sold to you." A murmur rippled through the crowd, then a cheer, faint at first but building. Cutter's face twisted, his smooth mask cracking. He snapped his fingers. "Kill them all." The first shot cracked and the square exploded into chaos. Rifles roared, horses screamed, and the air filled with dust so thick it stung the eyes. Mary ducked behind the water trough as bullets splintered wood. Elias fired from the hip, each shot precise, each recoil jarring his shoulders. The townsfolk hesitated for a heartbeat. Then the blacksmith grabbed his hammer and swung it into the jaw of the nearest rider. The ranchers followed, pistols drawn, their long fear finally snapping into fury. Cutter's men fell one by one, cut down by gunfire or dragged from their saddles by townsfolk who had lived too long under tribute. Smoke clouded the air, the church bell shuddering with every blast. In the chaos, Elias found Cutter. The outlaw had dismounted, standing near the well at the center of the square, revolver gleaming in his hand. Their eyes locked through the dust. Cutter sneered, lifted his gun. Elias' rifle was empty. He threw it aside, charging forward. The two men crashed together, fists striking, boots grinding in the dirt. Cutter's blade flashed from his belt, slicing Elias's arm, but Elias drove a knee into his ribs, wrenching the knife free. They grappled, stumbling against the well's stone rim, breath ragged, sweat and blood mixing in the dust. "You should have stayed dead when we left you," Cutter hissed. Elias's fist crashed against his jaw. "You should have stayed lawless in the dark." With a final heave, Elias slammed Cutter against the well, the outlaw's pistol clattering away. Dust rose as they fell, but when it cleared, Cutter lay sprawled in the dirt, beaten, his chest heaving shallow, his smile gone. Silence fell over the square. Smoke drifted, the last echoes of gunfire fading. Then Mary stepped forward, Samuel's badge still clutched in her hand. She pinned it to her dress, the tarnished star gleaming in the sunlight. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a roar of voices rose, townsfolk cheering, some weeping, others lifting rifles in the air. The square filled with a sound Dry Creek had not known in years. Victory. Elias stood, bloodied and battered, his breath ragged. He looked at Mary once, then turned, picking up his hat. He started to walk away, shoulders heavy, but his step steady. His debt was paid. Mary's throat tightened. She watched him cross the square, dust swirling around his boots, and something broke loose inside her chest. Her voice rang out, sharp and desperate. Elias saw to stay. Narrator voice after her line as the dust settles. Elias paid his debt in blood, and Dry Creek found its voice again. But every ending is only the beginning of another ride. Subscribe now and ring the bell, so you'll be the first to hear the next tale written in dust, steel, and fire. Ash still clung to the eaves when morning came. Dry Creek smelled of smoke and blood, but the thunder of gunfire had faded into memory. The square that had been a battlefield only hours before was now a graveyard of splintered wood, broken rifles, and blood-darkened dust. The townsfolk moved slow, their hands blistered, their faces hollow, yet there was something new in the air, something that had not been felt since Samuel Cartwright's badge still shone bright. Resolve. Mary Cartwright stood at the edge of the hill, overlooking the town's small cemetery. The ground was freshly turned, 10 graves marked with wooden crosses hastily cut by the carpenter's hands. Farmers, ranch hands, even a boy barely 16. They had fallen in the fight to reclaim their freedom. The townsfolk gathered close, heads bowed, the morning sun burning red through the haze. Mary's black shawl fluttered in the prairie wind as she stepped forward. Her voice trembled only once, then steadied. They wanted us broken. They wanted us bent. But these men and boys proved that Dry Creek still breathes. That courage still has a home here. She placed her hand on one of the crosses, her eyes fixed on the earth. My husband died for this town, and now so have these. We will not let their sacrifice rot in silence. We will not trade their blood for chains. The crowd murmured their assent, some weeping, some lifting their hats in solemn honor. Elias Harlan stood apart at the edge of the gathering, his scarred face turned down, his hat gripped tight in his hand. He had not spoken during the service, but when Mary looked back at him, he lifted his gaze. For a moment across the graves, there was an understanding deeper than words. By afternoon, the work of rebuilding began. Smoke still curled from the ruins of a farmhouse on the edge of town, and the church's windows were cracked, but the people moved with a strength born from defiance. Elias carried lumber on his shoulders to Mary's farm, where the barn door still bore the scar of Cutter's threat. He set to work with hammer and nails, the rhythm of each strike steady as a heartbeat. Mary worked beside him, her skirts tied up, her hands raw from lifting and sawing. They did not speak at first, but silence no longer felt like a gulf. It felt like ground being tilled, waiting for something to grow. At dusk, when the last beam was raised and the barn stood whole again, Mary leaned against the doorway, watching Elias wipe the sweat from his brow. The wind softened, carrying the scent of dust and wild sage instead of ash. For the first time in weeks, the prairie seemed calm. "You saved us," she said, her voice quiet, almost fragile. "But why stay?" Elias set down the hammer, his shoulders heavy but his eyes steady. "Because some debts," he said slowly, "don't end with blood." The words hung in the air, simple and raw, carrying the weight of years he had spent running, hiding, and paying for sins no one else cared to remember. Mary stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. For the first time since Samuel's death, she allowed herself to touch without fear of breaking. Elias's hardened eyes softened, the walls around them cracked by something he hadn't let himself feel in years. The prairie stretched wide around them, endless and open, no longer silent but alive with the murmur of rebuilding, of voices, of hope. The fire that had once threatened to consume Dry Creek now flickered in a different way. No longer destruction, but life rekindled. Elias did not speak again, and neither did she. Words were not needed, for in that quiet where grief and redemption met, a choice waited, not of wedding vows or chains, but of freedom, of love, of courage to begin again, and the prairie, scarred but unbroken, bore witness.